Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today's episode is episode 62, exploring Kenya's economics from the Maasai Mara to the Silicon Savannah with Mr. Paul Henrie Alama. Mr. Paul Henrie Alama is one of the smartest individuals I've met in my life. He is a recent graduate from the Alliance High School in Nairobi, which is arguably the best private school in Kenya. And he is also very smart when it comes to technology, politics, global affairs, and economics. I met Paul at Yale Young Global Scholars, where I had the privilege of learning a lot about Kenya and African continent and about African politics from him. Paul is definitely one of the most, if not the most intelligent and interesting person I have had in our podcast in Dollar Dialogue so far. So it's truly a privilege to have him on the podcast today. So before we proceed for the podcast, Paul, is there anything that you'd like to say?
Thank you, Arif, for the very fun intro. My name is Paul Alala, and I'm ready to talk about Kenya. Hopefully, you learn something from this podcast. Yeah,
Thank you, Mr. Paul Henry Alama. So for our first segment of Dollar Dialogue today, I'd like to briefly mention about the history of Kenya, so the viewers can understand about the politics, about why Kenya operates the way it does in today. So to understand a brief history about Kenya, to understand Kenya's economy today, I think it's better to know about its history, because Kenya wasn't designed to be an inclusive economy. It was designed to be an extractive economy. And the reason for that is colonialism. Just like Bangladesh, Kenya was under British colonial rule, and Kenya's economic structure was engineered around the settler agriculture, resource extraction, and transport efficiency, not just broad-based development. And the famous Uganda Railway, often celebrated as a marvel of colonial infrastructure, existed for one reason, which is to move goods from the interior to the coast. It connected land to ports, not people to opportunity. So colonial policy entrenched three long-lasting features. Firstly, concentrated the land ownership, regional inequality, as well as an export-oriented economy which was dependent on a few commodities. So while settlers controlled the most fertile land, and while African communities were pushed into reserves with limited access to capital, education, or markets. Hence, while the settlers profited, the British Empire profited. The most of the Kenyan people were left with nothing, as British extracted the resources and took them with them. And when Kenya eventually gained independence in 1963, it inherited a dual economy, a modern capital intensive sector coexisting with a vast underdeveloped informal one. And that duality it still exists in Kenya to some extent today. So post independence, Kenya took a more capitalist, market oriented pathway than many of its African neighbors. Under President and founder Jomo Kenyatta, the state encouraged private enterprise, foreign investment, and agricultural commercialization. And this helped Kenya avoid the full scale nationalizations seen elsewhere, but it also preserved elite dominance, and growth happened. However, inequality also deepened. By the 1970s and the 1980s, Kenya faced a familiar post colonial dilemma: rising population, slow growth, and mounting fiscal pressure. The response was structural adjustment programs. Backed by the IMF and the World Bank, Kenya liberated trade, cut subsidies, and reduced the role of the state. And these reforms stabilized macroeconomic indicators, but weakened public services and accelerated informality. The state shrank faster than the market could absorb workers. And additionally, in the 1990s, we have seen that Kenya had a high unemployment, and there was a few corruption scandals. However, the situation has changed in Kenya, because today the Kenya is often seen as the Silicon Savannah of Africa, with a lot of tech entrepreneurship, infrastructure-led growth, which started from the 2010s, and the country has moved forward without fully transforming sort of its foundation. And many of its attributes can be said to the current president, Mr. William Ruto. Mr. William Ruto is the current if I'm not mistaken, Mr. William Ruto is the current president of Kenya, and he has been the acting president of Kenya from 2014 and then he was also the deputy president of Kenya from 2013 to 2022. And previously, Mr. William Ruto was the minister of education of Kenya as well. So a lot of Kenya's success story today is set to be under Mr. William Ruto. So I wanted to ask Paul, since you're like a Kenyan citizen and you have been living in Nairobi, would you say that under President William Ruto, Kenya has experienced growth? And could you like share some insights in detail about how William Ruto has helped the Kenyan economy grow?
Thank you, Arif, for that. Well, I'd say under William Ruto's reign, it's been up and down, definitely. Of course, no leader is 100% perfect. We are still evolving. And Ruto assumed power in 2022, if I'm not wrong. And for the first 2 years, for the first 1, 2 years, of course, there were challenges. Um, you bring in the Gen Z protests, where us as Gen Zs of Kenya, we had to protest over some bad leadership. But over time, it's gotten better. Right now, the economy has stabilized, and everyone would say at least we have improved compared to the first 2 years of him in office. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Paul, for that response. I was also wondering that Kenya, just like Bangladesh, was under British colonial rule. Would you say, living in Kenya, do you still experience those sort of colonial effects?
For the colonial effects, of course, we still feel the weight of the Western power in Kenya, and most mostly would say it's the Indians, not really the British, because the Indians in Kenya are the ones who are millionaires and billionaires. The Indians are the people who own the biggest industries in Kenya and run most of the Kenyan businesses. And also, William Ruto at least has managed to establish good relations with the Western culture, with Western countries such as France, US, Britain, and all of them, all the Western superpowers. So, of course, you still find that when you go to the supermarket, you find a British there, or you find a Kenyan, or you find a French person there. So yeah, still colonialism still hits to this very day. Yeah.
That is very interesting. Personally, like speaking historically, the Indians were originally the British during the British colonial rule from the Indian subcontinent. The British took Indian sort of slaves and put them in Africa to work in different fields, and eventually the Indians had education. Later on, they used that education to control the businesses. An interesting fact was that in the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken, or in the 1960s, then president of Uganda, Mr. Idi Amin Dada Ume, he actually kicked out the Indians living in Uganda. Although, and his reasoning was that they were not part of the Ugandan economy. However, we have seen that the Indians living in Uganda at that point in time, they were living for like 4 or 5 generations. And although some people might say that just like in South Africa as well, before apartheid, a lot of the businesses were owned by specifically people of the white community. And in countries like Uganda and Kenya as well, we are currently seeing that a lot of the businesses are owned by Indians. So would you say that that what the Indians are like, since Indians control most of the businesses, is that similar to what apartheid was in South Africa, or would you say like it's a bit different than Kenya?
I'd say it's a bit different because Indians originally came to Kenya through the Kenya Ugandan Railway. When they were building the Kenya to Ugandan Railway, Indians came as workers for the British. Then over time, these Indians decided to reside in Kenya instead of going back to India. and started family-owned businesses, just little businesses around the 1950s and 1960s. And as generations come and as generations go, the Indians who assume their father's CEO position of the family-owned businesses now rise up, learn new skills, come give to their son grows up, gives it to the son, like that. And one of the examples we do have is Manu Chandaria, whose grandfather or great grandfather was an Indian who had come to Kenya to build the Kenya Ugandan Railway, but decided to stay and start a family owned business. And the skills continued to be passed down. And Manu Chandaria decided to take all the skills. He went and studied abroad, came to Kenya, and revolutionized the family owned business. Now it's a multi-million dollar company here in Kenya. So most of these Indian businesses are once small family owned businesses, but right now they're really, really huge.
Thank you, Paul, for that insightful response. Mr. I see that Mr. Subit Nagala, your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in? Apologies, viewers. It seems like Mr. Supit Nagala is currently facing internet difficulties. So just to wrap up what Paul was talking about, in Kenya, as we have seen, a lot of there's a lot of sort of in a way there is a dilemma because the Indian community in Kenya is quite powerful in shaping the country's economy, and as Paul has clearly stated, and he has given his insights that a lot of these. A lot of these businesses are family owned, and basically, as Paul was saying, that since their like father, for example, was the CEO of the company, naturally the sons of the Indian heritage community in Kenya became the next CEOs, and eventually that business expanded, as a result to which majority of the large businesses in Kenya is now also owned by Indians. And just to provide some content, Kenyans Indian community is small but in size but outsized in economic impact. I was researching about this, and I learned that today Kenyan Indians make up roughly around 1 to 1.5% of the population, which is not a lot of Kenya, which is around 100,000 people. Yet they're estimated to control 40% of the private sector wealth in Kenya. And this is just nuts to me because a significant share of formal businesses, especially manufacturing, wholesale, trade, retail, and logistics, is owned by a small minority of people. And as Paul has cleared, it's not like apartheid in South Africa where the whites control the businesses. As in Kenya, everyone is equal in the rule of law, and it's a bit different than the apartheid. However, it's still interesting to see that a lot of the 40% of the private sector wealth in India is controlled. In Kenya is controlled by 1% of its Indian population. So I see Mr. Shazib Karim, your hand is raised. Would you like to perhaps elaborate on the economic effects of the Indian diaspora living in Kenya?
Yes, for sure, Arif, and thank you for your insights. But um, before that, I also wanted to add that Kenya. I'm sure you mentioned this too, but just to add on to you, Kenya, it's one of the largest and most diversified economies in sub-Saharan Africa, and its capital Nairobi. It isn't just a political hub; it's a financial and tech center for the entire region, and the three main sectors that their economy is driven by, I'd say, is probably services, like for example, finance, tourism, ICT, and more, and agriculture, for example, tea, coffee, etc. And then their industry and infrastructure. And I think all these together make Kenya a gateway economy for the East African community. And also, adding on, I think if there's one innovation that defines Kenya, it's M-Pesa. Launched in 2007, M-Pesa transferred how money moves. Over 90% of adults in Kenya use mobile money. Millions of unbanked citizens gained access to payments, savings, and credit. And small businesses could suddenly operate in the formal economy. And economically, this meant higher financial inclusion, lower transaction costs, and faster circulation of money. Thus, Kenya didn't just adopt fintech, it exported the model across the entirety of Africa. And I think The Indian presence, to answer your question, Arif, as you mentioned, it began during the colonial period when thousands were brought to East Africa to build railways and work in trade. And over time, many stayed. And today, Kenyan Indians play a disproportionately large role in the economy relative to their population size. And I say that because Indian owned businesses dominate large parts of wholesale and retail trade, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, textiles, and logistics. And in cities like Nairobi and Mombasa, Indian families run supply chains that link small Kenyan retailers to entire global markets. And economically, this has meant strong private sector investment, efficient distribution networks, and long term capital retention within Kenya. And many of these businesses reinvest profits locally and contributing to employment and industrial growth back in India as well. And Indian Kenyans have also been central to informal and formal credit systems, especially before widespread banking access. And this matters because small and medium enterprises are the backbone of Kenya's economy. And access to credit determines who can expand and who remains stuck in substances. And I think when paired with innovations like M-Pesa, like mentioned before, Indian-run enterprises adapted quickly, integrating fintech into traditional business models and accelerating Kenya's transition towards a cash-led economy. However, this influence is not without controversy, because some critics argue that economic power is unevenly distributed. Certain communities dominate capital-intensive sectors, and wealth accumulation has not always translated into inclusive growth. And this feeds into a broader Kenyan debate: who benefits from growth and who is left behind? Here, Indian residents become a part of a larger structural issue, not the cause, but a visible symbol uh, of how capitalism, colonial legacies, and inequality intersect in Kenya. But with all this said, I think like overall, Kenya's economy is not just a story of tech innovation or infrastructure spending. It's a story of people, migration, and legacy. And I think the challenge ahead is not removing these dynamics, but managing them. Like, for example, reducing inequality, balancing private enterprise with social stability. And I think if Kenya gets this right, it won't just be East Africa's economic hub. It could become a model for multicultural interconnect development in the entirety of the global south.
Thank you, Mr. Shadov Karim, for that very insightful response. So moving on towards the next segment of the podcast, which is about if I'm not mistaken, we'll look into Kenya's GDP growth versus everyday life. So in one of the previous Dollar Dialogue episodes, we had deeply analyzed Kenya, if I'm not mistaken, Kenya, Tanzania, and other East African countries, and we tried to look into the GDP growth. And if I'm not mistaken, Kenya is often compared to Tanzania, which is its neighbor, in terms of economic growth, and both of these countries have experienced tremendous prosperity in its past. Tanzania is currently experiencing, however, a faster growth than Kenya, with 2026 projections placing Tanzania's growth at around 6 to 7% compared to Kenya's 5%. However, Kenya does hold a higher total GDP and acts as the regional economic hub of Africa. And to just move on, I would like to talk about Kenya's economic growth over the past couple of decades. And to just elucidate a bit on that, Kenya has been one of East Africa's stronger, if not the strongest country economically in East Africa. Between 2010 and 2019, the Kenyan economy grew at an average of 6% per year, driven by mainly services, constructions, finance, ICT, and tourism. Even after the COVID shock, when the GDP of Kenya contracted by 0.3%, which is basically negligible, Kenyan economy rebounded quickly, posting economic growth of around 8% in 2021 and around 5% in 2022 to 2023 fiscal year. In terms of size, Kenya's GDP is now roughly $115 billion, making it East Africa's largest economy. Services account for over 50% of GDP, agriculture about 25%, and manufacturing only about 10%. So growth has always been investment heavy in Kenya. Large infrastructure projects, roads, railways, energy helped raise productivity and regional connectivity, but they were largely debt financed. At the same time, population growth, which is now over 50 million people, means GDP growth has to be high just to keep income stable. As a result, the GDP per capita has growth has been slower, often below 2% in recent years. So in short, we are seeing that Kenya is growing. However, it's not fast enough and not in right places to significantly raise the living standards for most people. Additionally, on paper, Kenya's economy does look very strong. In the decade before COVID-19, GDP growth averaged around 6%, as I've said before, making it one of East Africa's fastest growing economies. Services now account for over 55% of GDP, as mentioned before. However, it is important to note that youth unemployment is very high in Kenya, which is estimated to be around 40%, and 80% of the jobs in Kenya are still informal. So, therefore, we see a lot of gaps in the fact that Nairobi generates one third of national GDP, while other Kenyan districts are very below the poverty line in most cases, and poverty rates in rural counties in Kenya are more than double of those in capital. Economically, this is a classic case of jobless growth, where expansion happens in capital intensive urban sectors while most workers remain stuck in low productivity activities. And for many Kenyans, growth shows up in spreadsheets and policy reports, but not their shopping basket. So, as mentioned before, Kenya's youth unemployment rate is around 40%, which is very high. So, about one in about in 10 people, in 10 youth, around four of them are unemployed. So I was just wondering, Paul, could you like based on living in Kenya and from your personal experiences, could you explain as to why the youth unemployment rate is very high in Kenya? Is there any sort of political or economic reasons for it?
From my understanding of the high unemployment rates, I think it's also based on our education system, because our education system is 844, meaning you have 8 years in primary school, 4 years in secondary school, 4 years in university, then you enter the job market. And I'd say that Kenya, although it's very savvy on education, I also feel like it lacks the necessary resources to tell students on how to be self-reliant and also adaptable to the current trends. You get in university, we still read books published in 1999 about business and economics. So when that student finishes university, he comes to apply this knowledge from 1999, from the 1980s, that is gotten from the textbooks. But when he enters the job market requires you to have hands-on skills, to have AI knowledge, to have computer knowledge that really isn't in the books. So you find that a student really concentrates so much on the on reading this outdated books. So I'd say the reason is also the outdated books. People are reading books that when you apply them into the real market, you don't really survive. And the other thing, the second reason I'd say is more of a political reason, which is the leaders who are there, they tend to benefit their friends. A leader gets into power, and the first thing he does is just create opportunities for his friends. So the rich people in Kenya end up getting richer, and the poor end up getting poorer. In Kenya, what really matters is connections. If you don't have the necessary connections, you are left out. If you don't know a person who knows a person who knows a person in Kenya, you feel left out. And that's the reality for the poor people in Kenya. So a person might have all the necessary skills or all the necessary knowledge, but when they enter into the job market, the leader in Kenya has favored his friend, has put his friend in that position, and the friend isn't really as talented, isn't knowledgeable. So you find that the people who hold high offices aren't really suit, suited for those positions, and the people who are suited for those positions are left out because they didn't have the necessary connection. So to summarize it all, number one I'd say is reading outdated books or outdated things that don't really apply to the job market. And number two is the leadership and this helping friends out in politics that really affects our unemployment rates. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul, for that brilliant response. It was very interesting, and I would say that's a very, very logical response that you gave in Kenya. And I would say the situation in Bangladesh is also in somewhat very similar, as many of the books, national curriculum books, are outdated in rural places. And I also agree that in the political sphere, specifically in developing countries, and I don't think it's just limited to Kenya, we see that political alliances often helps those who have political connections, and oftentimes people who have political connections are not suited or not conducive enough to lead those roles. One thing that you did mention was the fact that in Kenya, specifically in like public universities, there has been a lot of protest, and I can say the same thing about Bangladesh as well. So student protest has become as I was researching, that student protest has become a recurring feature of Kenya's education landscape, and specifically in the last decade. And I was reading in the newspaper from the Daily Nation, if I'm not mistaken, which is an online Kenyan newspaper. And one clear example is the wave of university student protest linked to HELB loan delays and fee hikes, particularly at institutions like University of Nairobi, Kenyatta University, and the Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology, which is also known as JQuat. So, in multiple instances such as 2022 and 2023, students blocked roads, clashed with police, and shut down campuses after the Higher Education Loans Board delayed reimbursements, leaving many unable to pay rent, food, or tuition. At the basic education level, opposing to the competency-based curriculum (CBC), using the 844 rule that Paul was talking about. This has also triggered protest, with teachers' unions and parents organizing demonstrations over poor training, increased cost, and lack of facilities in public schools. These education related protests reflect a deeper frustration in Kenya, which is basically that students in Kenya are told that education is an opportunity, yet graduate into an economy where 40% of the youth are basically unemployed. There is a rising cost in living and shrinking public support. In that context, student protest in Kenya, I would say, is not just about curriculums or curricula or classrooms. It's about a broken promise from like the system between education, employment, and social mobility. So therefore, with that being said, Paul, based on the student protest, have you like experienced any student protest in Kenya? And is your school, the Alliance High School, would you say there has been any demonstrations in your school as well?
That's a good question. In my high school, Alliance High School, we didn't have any such protests. The good thing with Alliance High School is it's supported by the government in a way. So, and also Alliance High School is the best high school in Kenya. So definitely, if Alliance High School has a problem, the government has a way to sort it out. On your on your question about student protests, yeah, they do happen. I haven't experienced it firsthand, but I'd say this: when Kenyan students after high school, we have to apply for universities, and when we apply for universities, one of the highest risks that students face while selecting universities is they don't really know how long they're going to stay in the universities, because you might sign in for a course scheduled to run for 4 years, but when you get into your first semester, what does happen is there are student trials. People start complaining about, the help loans being delayed. People start complaining about the government eating the funds and corruption going on. So that period, let's say it takes about 14 or 7 months of protests and mishap. By the time you get back to class, a lot has been covered. So you end up taking probably 6 years for a course that's supposed to take 4 years. And those strikes really affect the students. They take longer to finish their course compared to students who are in private universities. For example, the ones you've said, UON, JQuat, those ones are public universities, and students take so much time there because of course, the riots. But if you look at private universities, for example, Strathmore, you find that students take shorter time, and Strathmore has links abroad. So you'd find a brilliant student who's in UN taking so long to finish their course and enter the job market with um, insufficient skills, while the student who wasn't as bright, who went to Strathmore, which is a public university, gets out quickly and gets out with to date skills such as AI skills, computer skills that really helps them in the future. Yeah,
Thank you, Paul. That is a very insightful response. And for the viewers listening as well, Paul has also been accepted into Strathmore University, which is arguably the best private university in Kenya, which is once again a testament to Paul's intelligence. And also it shows that in Kenya there are a lot of good universities in Africa as well. In Africa, when we think about good universities, we often think about, for example, the University of Johannesburg or like other universities in Africa. However, Kenya has also one of the best universities in Africa, which are rising. And as Paul has mentioned, these universities are teaching students up to date skills in AI, which is also not seen in other public universities. Therefore, therefore the rise in, therefore we can also see that universities in Kenya, the private universities are really good compared to the public ones. So therefore, the one thing the government can do is invest more in public universities and public school curriculum to ensure students receive better education compared to those in private education. And to move on to the next segment of the podcast, which is about debt finance development. China, I would like to talk about China, Kenya, and the cost of speed. So Kenya's modern infrastructure boom did not happen by accident. It was driven by deliberate political choices, largely through debt, and much of it came from China. The flagship project is the standard gauge railway SGR linking Mombasa to Nairobi, and this was launched in 2017 under President Uhuru Kenyatta. And built by the China Road and Bridge Corporation. The SDR cost roughly 4 billion US dollars, and this was financed mostly through loans from the China Exim Bank. And while it cut travel time in Kenya from Mombasa to Nairobi and symbolized the modernization, the railway has struggled financially, generating revenues far below projections and becoming a focal point of Kenya's debt debate. So beyond the SGR, Chinese financing support major highway projects such as the Nairobi Expressway, which was completed in 2022 at a cost of about 750 million US dollars, which was once again built by China and Road Bridge Corporation under a private-public partnership. Kenya also borrowed heavily for energy projects, including power transmission lines and geothermal expansion, and for port and logistic upgrades around Mombasa and the Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia Transport uh, Lab SSET corridor, which was a long-term mega project championed by successive governments. And these investments have reshaped Kenya's physical landscape, but they have also reshaped its physical balance sheet. Kenya today is not the Kenya it was 10 years ago. The amount of development, the amount of roads and bridges that have been built today is unprecedented. And in some ways, Kenya is often referred to as a Singapore of Africa, and this is often goes hand in hand with Rwanda as well. Rwanda has also experienced similar economic growth, just like Kenya. So Kenya's debt to GDP ratio from 2021 to 2023 exceeded 70%, and the total public debt in Kenya was around 9 trillion Kenyan shilling, which is over 70 billion US dollar. and debt financing consume more than 60% of government revenue. So external debt exposure rose sharply due to currency depreciation, making dollar-denominated loans more expensive to pay. And I would like to talk about briefly about the political figures involved as well. So under President Uhuru Kenyatta, who was the president from 2013 to 2022, he prioritized infrastructure growth, which is why we have seen that under him the SGR, which was the standard gauge railway linking Mombasa to Nairobi, was launched. And also, we can see the Nairobi Expressway was launched under him as well. Sorry, that was launched under President William Ruto. However, the idea was under President Uhuru Kenyatta. Former Finance Minister Henry Rotich was a central architect of Kenya's borrowing strategy, and the current Finance Minister, Mr. Juguna Dongu, is tasked with stabilizing public finances under pressure. And I might have pronounced some of the names wrong, so apologies to the viewers listening. So, from a political economy perspective, the logic is clear. Kenya is building infrastructure, and by building infrastructure, they are also winning votes, because the more development the country happens, the more people are seeing that our politicians are actually trying to build the country. However, there is an underlying issue with it. Although Kenya is being developed, a lot of these developments are coming from China. And although this is not a bad thing, Kenya is borrowing way too much money, and as a result of which, paying off these loans is an issue. An example I can provide is Bangladesh is near Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a country in South Asia, and if I'm not mistaken, the Sri Lanka Hambom Borna port, which was a port built by the Chinese, were actually taken from the Chinese because the Sri Lankan economy could not pay the loan back. As a result, the Chinese, if I'm not mistaken, the CCP, they basically took over the loan, and this was perfectly legal. People often say that China had no right to do that. However, we have to understand, when we take on a loan, either we pay it or our assets get seized, and that's the reality of the financial engineering that happens behind loans. And although it's not something that is often morally acceptable, this is the reality of the world. As a result of which, one grave issue that particularly that I'm thinking about is, although Kenya is building so much of these railways, borrowing so much from the Chinese Exim Bank might be a question. And currently, if I'm not mistaken, as to how much Kenya has paid China back in terms of loan. This is something that I was researching as well, and I figured out that in recent years, Kenya borrowed about $5 billion from the Export Import Bank of China in 2014 to 2015 to fund the first phases of the SGR from Mombasa to Nairobi and Naivasha. And as of mid 2024, roughly 3.5 billion of that Chinese SGR loan has remained unpaid. So over 10 years, yeah, Kenya has paid $1.5 billion. However, $3.5 billion is still unpaid. Kenya pays about $1 billion per year servicing Chinese debt, and this is principal and interest combined as well. And while researching, I also found out that between July and December 2024, Kenya paid around 231 billion Kenyan shillings in foreign debt, and majority of it went to China. So what this means for the viewers is that Kenya originally borrowed $5 million from China to for major infrastructure projects, and largely a large amount of that was the SGR project. A significant portion, around $3.5 billion out of that $5 billion loan, has not been paid yet. And recent treasury figures confirm that around one quarter of Kenya's foreign debt repayments go to Chinese creditors. So my question to Mr. Paul is that, firstly, have you seen a lot of infrastructure in Nairobi and other parts of Kenya? Obviously, in pictures, I've seen the SGR connecting Mombasa to Nairobi. But other than that, have you seen other developments as well? And second question is that, as a Kenyan, would you say you are worried about paying back a lot of these Chinese loans that are financing these infrastructure projects?
Mm, definitely. I have seen a lot of development projects, a lot of infrastructure being built. Mostly it started, as you said, from the Uhuru Kenyatta period, where he prioritized infrastructure, he prioritized building of roads, building of highways, building of expressways. to curb the problem of traffic congestion, which was very rampant in Kenya. And at least we see the infrastructure helping out a lot of people. And yes, the issue with this is these infrastructure projects are being used as a political stunt because a president might come into his term. The first few years he does absolutely nothing. Then to the tail end of his term, now he says, now I want to build things, I want to do everything. So he uses it as a political stunt so that in the next election you vote for them. Then when they enter power, the first 2 years is blunt. Then the tail end of his term, now he starts building things. So most of the time in Kenya, it's used as a political stunt rather than for development and helping people, which should change. And yes, but I cannot argue that it has helped a lot of people, including myself. The area we live in, which is Nairobi West, there's a highway that has been built that has curbed a lot of traffic congestion, which used to hamper a lot of processes in our transportation, but now it's smoother. That's for your first question. The second question about repaying these loans, it's tough. It's really difficult because under Uhuru's reign, the debt really rose to very, very high numbers, and it definitely has very many repercussions to the coming generation. And under Ruto's reign, you can't really see that the debts are going lower. It's roughly still around the same place. And yeah, that is a really huge challenge to the coming generation. And we need to do something about it, definitely, because the debt is a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul, for that response, and I wholeheartedly agree with what you said. Kenya today is facing sort of this debt issue. However, I do think that as a rising economy in Africa, and arguably the largest economy in East Africa, Kenya should be fine in order to pay back these loans. And we have seen, and also one more thing to note is that Kenya is currently, in terms of political stability, Kenya has been the most politically stable it has been in years, and a large part of that has been due to President William Ruto, as well as President Uhuru Kenyatta. And large part of that political stability means that a lot of foreigners are coming to Kenya in order to invest money in Kenyan projects and in Kenyan businesses as well. And as a result of which, Kenya is thriving. Another large factor is the tourism. Personally, my geography teacher, my previous geography teacher, back when I was in grade 9, and currently my theory of knowledge or philosophy teacher, Dr. Joan Mukabe Kimani. Doctor, if you're watching this, I'd like to and for the viewers as well. So my teacher, she's also from Kenya, and she has repeatedly said in class that Kenya has been the richest country in Africa, and has also argued multiple times over that Kenya is richer than Nigeria. Although I have debated about that with Dr. Kimani multiple times. So I just want to say that political stability in Kenya is a very interesting issue, and this is a double-edged sword, because on one hand, we have seen that Kenya is often considered as one of the most politically stable countries, and in some way that's true. Since the return to multi-party democracy in 1992, Kenya has held regular elections, experienced multiple peaceful transfers of power, and maintained relatively strong institutions compared to many regional peers. But Kenya's political stability has always been conditional. Elections are very competitive, but they're also very tense. The most dramatic rupture came in 2007 and 2008, when a disputed presidential election between MY Kibaki and Raila Odinga triggered post-election violence that killed over 1,100 people and displaced more than 600,000. That crisis exposed how quickly political competition could spill into ethnic and economic conflict. And reforms followed. The 2010 Kenyan parliamentary constitution was a major turning point, introducing devolution to 47 counties, stronger checks on executive power, a more independent judiciary, and these reforms helped stabilize politics, but they didn't eliminate tension. In 2017, Kenya faced turmoil when the Supreme Court annulled the presidential election, an unprecedented move in Africa, citing irregularities. While violence has been more contained than in 2008, it reinforced a pattern. Elections remain moments of high political and economic risk. More recently, stability has taken a different form. Under President William Ruto, who was elected in 2022, Kenya has avoided large scale electoral violence but has seen rising issues, protests, especially around tax increases, cost of living, IMF backed austerity, and youth unemployment. The 2023 and 2024 protests, including demonstrations against the Finance Bill 2024, were notable because they were less ethnic, more youth driven, focused on economic grievances rather than election results. And this signals an important shift. Kenya's politics is no longer about primarily electoral, it is about economic and generational. From an investor and a policymaker's perspective, Kenya remains institutionally intact. There has been no coup in Kenya, no military coup. The courts and Supreme Court are not corrupt. They are always trying to focus on the rule of law. And there is an active civil society and free media in Kenya, which is largely unprecedented in many other African nations, including Kenya's neighbors. For example, Uganda. And additionally, I would also like to talk about briefly about how politics comes hand in hand with the with ethnic groups in Kenya. And ethnicity has always been one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, force in Kenyan politics. In Kenya, politics and ethnicity go hand in hand. With over 40 ethnic groups, political competition has been historically aligned along ethnic lines, especially among larger communities like the Kikuyu, the Luo, the Kalenjin, and the Luhya. Since independence in 1963, access to political power has frequently been associated with access to economic opportunity, jobs, contracts, infrastructure, and public spending, making elections feel like high stakes, winner takes it all. And this dynamic encourages politicians to mobilize support to ethnic identity rather than policy, reinforcing loyalty to ethnicity and community over actual ideology. As a result, the consequences has been serious at times, most notably during the 2007-2008 post-election violence, with ethnic polarization turned political disputes into national crisis. And while constitutional reforms in 2010 and devolution to 47 counties reduced some of these pressures, ethnicity remains deeply embedded in Kenya's political economy. So, with that being said, I had a question for Mr. Paul. So, Paul, living in Kenya, would you say that you have experienced or have you seen or heard from your parents about the different ethnic groups and ethnic violence? And would you say that the ethnic violence has sort of increased or decreased in recent times?
Definitely. That is a brilliant question. Kenya definitely is a political country. And just from the political parties that we have UDA, which is the current political party in power, which is William Ruto's party. UDA is a mix of Kalenjin and Kikuyus mostly. And if you look at the Kenyan political landscape in 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 detail, you'll actually realize that most of the votes that a presidential candidate or a member of parliament candidate looks for is normally embedded in the Mount Kenya region. The Mount Kenya region mainly consists of the Bantus of Kenya, which is the Kikuyus, the Kambas, who are the most dominant ones among other Bantu communities. So currently, UDA is the political party of Ruto and it has Kalenjins and Kikuyus majorly. If you look at President Uhuru Kenyatta's party was Jubilee Party. In his time, it was mainly the Kikuyus and the Kambas as well. So you can see a trend in those two, where the Kikuyus and the Kambas and the Bantu community in particular determine whether a president wins an election or loses an election. If we look concurrently, we have the ODM party, which was led by His Right Honorable Raila Amolo Odinga, who just passed away recently, who has been a political enigma in the Kenyan landscape, and who has a record of losing the presidential seat, I think, 5 times in a row, just because he was Luo and he couldn't garner enough votes from the Mount Kenya region, definitely. And Raila Amolo Odinga's party is ODM, and ODM consists of the Luos and the Luyas. So if you just see from our Kenyan politics, it's those two who are constantly battling each other for the presidency. Yes. So it's a political and tribal affair, and it's also an interesting thing to look at as a Kenyan citizen. And even in our family, you'd realize that probably me and my sister, even though we are Luos, we support UDA. We just for an example, but our parents support ODM, and our parents really inflict that tribal card on us. But the good thing about the Gen Zs is the Gen Zs of Kenya, we don't really have a tribe. We are united, whether you're Luo, whether you're Kikuyu, whether you're Kamba, whether you're Luya. Us as Gen Zs, we are united. So you can find a Luo supporting UDA, you can find a Kamba supporting ODM. Yeah, that is the direction we're heading to as Kenya. But in the past, definitely politics was really determined by the tribe you came from. Yes.
Thank you, Paul, for that amazing response. That was really eye-opening to me, and definitely I learned a lot from that. And so, and moving on, I would say, I see that Mr. Supreet Nagala, your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in for a moment? Apologies, viewers. It seems like Mr. Stupid Nagala is having technical difficulties. So moving on. Just to wrap up for our podcast for today, the final segment. In our podcast today, we have definitely learned a lot from Paul. And in our discussions with me, Paul, and Mr. Shazib Karim, we have seen in Kenya, economics, politics, and ethnicity are not separate stories. They are deeply intertwined. With more than 40 ethnic groups, political competition has aligned along ethnic lines, specifically among larger communities such as the Kikuyu, Luyu, the Kalenjin, and the Luya. Since independence in 1963, control of the presidency has been often associated, rightly or wrongly, with access to state resources, public jobs, infrastructure, and development spending. And this has made politics feel winner takes it all, raising the stakes of elections far beyond ideology or policy. We have also talked about a lot in terms of Kenyan history, of how the British colonialism has created the economy that we see in Kenya today. Moving on, we also talked about the Indian community in Kenya, which is roughly 1.5% of the population. However, they control around 40% of the public sector. Afterwards, we also talked about Kenya's economy on paper versus in reality. We talked about how services make up roughly 55% of the economy. Additionally, we also looked into Kenya's economic growth, which is driven by finance, ICT, and tourism. Next, we talked about Kenya's education system, and we talked about the 844 system in Kenya, which is the 8 years primary, 4 years secondary, and the 4 years undergraduate. We also talked about how the country boasts one of the highest literacy rates in sub-Saharan Africa at around 80%, which is very high compared to other neighboring African nations. We also saw the fact that Kenya introduced primary education system in 2003, and today primary enrollment rate exceed 90%. Moving on, we then discussed about how Kenyan how there's also a lot of student protest in Kenya, and how public universities are often overshadowed by stronger private universities like Strathmore. Additionally, we next on we talked about Kenya's uh, high finance development, which was a lot of which came under President Uhuru Kenyatta's time period, and this was driven by Chinese loans. And we also discussed about how this might be worrying for Kenyans. However, based on Kenya's increasing GDP, that should not be an issue. Lastly, we talked about the different ethnicities which exist in Kenya, the Kikuyu, the Luo, and the Kalenjin. We also heard about Paul's personal experiences throughout all the different segments of the podcast, and how it has shaped him living in Kenya, and also as a global citizen. I particularly like the Gen Z reference. So that was basically what we talked about in the podcast for today. And before we leave the podcast, Paul, is there anything else that you would like to say to the viewers and you'd like to say before we end the podcast for today?
I'd just like to shout out Aisha Speed for coming to Kenya and creating such a global audience for us. I remember I was just sitting at the sitting room on a Sunday evening, or rather a Sunday afternoon, and I just see the TV and I see Speed was coming like near our house, and I remember running outside and seeing the the kind of crowd that Aisha Speed really attracted. And I also loved how Kenya handled the matter, where we took Aisha Speed and how the Kenyan tourism sector stood up at that time where the global audience was on us, where somebody as important as Aisha Speed, who arguably is the greatest streamer in the world, actually came to Kenya. And I just like to point out that such kind of things really make Kenya special, and they shouldn't be taken for granted. The mere fact that Aisha Speed even chose Kenya to visit just shows how well Kenya is recognized in the global affairs of things. Yeah, definitely. If Aisha Speed is watching this or anyone close to Aisha Speed, yeah, thank you. That was a very good experience. Mostly when he passed near our house, it was like a dream come true. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul, for that, for the parting words. And definitely, I did not know about that incident. Aisha Speed is arguably one of the largest streamers in the world today, and him visiting Kenya just goes on to show that Kenya is a rising power in the world, and also it is one of the largest economies and politically significant countries in Africa. So, for the viewers listening, that was all for episode 62 today, which is about exploring Kenya's economics from Masai Mara to the Silicon Savannah with Mr. Paul Henry Alama. And thank you, viewers, for listening. And stay tuned for another very interesting episode, with another very interesting guest speaker soon. So thank you all for listening, and goodbye for now.